Okay, everybody, we are ready to get started. So let me officially begin by recording this session. So here's our announcement. Welcome, everybody. We are live streaming this class today and we are recording it. So it will be on our YouTube channel and our past recordings page. My name is Kerry Sautner. I'm with the National Constitution Center, and I'll be your moderator today and walk you through all this great contact with one of our top scholars, Tom Donnelly. Tom, would you like to introduce?
I would love to. Hi, I'm Tom Donnelly. I am one of the senior fellows for Constitutional Studies at the National Constitution Center and can't wait to talk with everyone about the Electoral College today.
And it is a hot topic. It is a current topic, and it has some of my favorite stories in American history. If you really wanted some juicy, gossipy, kind of amazingly tense stories, you're going to get them today. So let's dive into it really deeply. And Tom, I'll give you my three big questions for the today. Number one, let's be honest, you have to explain the Electoral College to all of us. What the heck is it and how does it work? Because we can't dive into the history or the question about it today, the relevance of it today, without understanding how it works. And that leads me to my second topic, second question. It's not so easy. It's not like a simple system. So why did the founding fathers pick such a kind of a tricky and unique way, one might say, to pick a president in our country? And then how's it been tested over time? And then my final question is, we all want to talk about is what's the current debate? What is the debate around the Electoral College? Because a lot of our students hear these debates, but we want to make sure that they understand the foundation around it so they can then dive into the discussion and feel comfortable with what they know and listening to other people. So that's our goals for today. Tom, are you ready to get going?
I am. They are big goals, but we will hopefully achieve them.
Oh yeah, in 35 minutes. We can do it.
No problem.
Okay, so let's get started. Do you want to look at the Constitution first, or do you want to start with what is the Electoral College?
Well, let's put the constitutional text is so long. Let's just put it on the screen because we always do begin with the text. But rather than going through all the details in the text itself, let's just back up and say, what is the Electoral College? How does it work? I mean, really, to make it relevant, let's think, how does it work today? How does it really work today? So let's think about that. So the Electoral College, it's the system we use to select a president. So today, the Electoral College is made up of 538 electors drawn from the states and from the District of Columbia. And under Article 2 of the US Constitution, the states are given a number of electors that's equal to the number of members of Congress that it has. So how does this work? So if a state has, here's actually, perfect slide, Kerry. So it's a very simple calculation. So Delaware has 2 senators and 1 member of the US House of Representatives. So it has 3 members of the Electoral College. Here, and we can look at Pennsylvania. So it has 12 members. It's a bigger state, so 12 members of the US House of Representatives, 2 senators, and it gets 20 electoral votes. And so there we're linking the number of votes in the Electoral College to how many members you have in Congress. So that's the basic calculation. The one thing to add is, where does DC come in with this? Well, that's a later amendment. That's the 23rd Amendment to the Constitution, gives Washington, D.C. 3 electoral votes. So it brings DC voters into the presidential election process. So, that's a bit about where there's all these numbers you see on the screen. Those are the different electoral votes for different states. My home state of New Jersey, 14. So you can see it really varies quite a bit by state. The lowest you would have is 3, because you would have 1 representative in the US House of Representatives and 2 senators. So the Electoral College, what is it? Where does it fit into? So we know we have election day. We know people go to the polls. Where does the Electoral College fit in? So the Electoral College itself is an actual body that meets in December after election day and casts votes for president. It is, it's laid out in the Constitution, Article 2, and it's a body that actually meets in the various states in December. But where does it fit in? So you see the first graphic there, we're going to say that's all of the American people, that's all the American voters, people that are eligible to vote in America. They go to the polls on election day. And so, in our minds, we're thinking we're voting for a particular president and vice president, a particular ticket. But technically speaking, what our votes do is it determines who are the electors going to be in the Electoral College. So that's that group of 4 people you see in the middle there. In fact, it's a group of 538 people that meet in December in the various states and cast a vote for president and for vice president. And it's based on that vote, the vote in the Electoral College, that we come up with who the president is going to be in the end. And so there's a connection between the American people voting in presidential elections, determining who the electors will be in the Electoral College, who will determine who the president of the United States is. One thing to emphasize all the way up front, and as we tell the founding story of the Electoral College, it's going to come through, is that, one story here, it's a story of federalism, which we talked about last week, sort of this distribution of power between the states and the national government. And the founding generation left the question of how we're going to select the electors to the state legislatures. And so the states come up with different rules for how we come up with the electors. This has varied over time in American history. But if you're looking at, what's the big point of, what's the big takeaway there? It's that over time, and beginning with the earliest elections for president, the American people themselves have played a pivotal central role in selecting a president. And so if we look at the states today, 48 states and the District of Columbia follow a very simple rule. It's called a winner take all. And here's the example. Kerry has California on the screen. So candidate Smith gets around 8 million votes. Candidate Jones for president gets 5 million votes. And California assigns all of its electoral votes to whoever wins the popular vote in the state. So if candidate Smith won the state by a single vote, candidate Smith would get all 55 of California's electoral votes. Candidate Jones would get none. Just to make sure we're on the same page, where does that 55 number come from? Again, it's a calculation of the number of members of the House of Representatives California has, which is 53, and it's 2 United States senators. And so that's how 48 states and the District of Columbia select how to allocate their electoral votes.
And this, just to clarify, because we talked in the beginning about federalism, this choice to make it your state a winner take all, that is up to the states to choose how they play out those electoral votes, correct?
That's absolutely right.
Yeah,
and I was going to say, even Kerry, if you look at when George Washington was elected president at the very beginning, some states held no popular vote at all, and the state legislatures just assigned the electors, and some states allowed a popular vote then informed who the electors would be. So we see the variation from the very beginning with states making choices about how the electors are going to be selected.
Because I think that's really important, because we talk a lot about what's in the Constitution, but then we go back to last week's class on federalism and say there's some give and take and some play here between what are the guidelines in the Constitution and what's the application that the state has in its power. And so California has chosen to say it's going to be a winner take all state. And I think that's really fascinating to think that it could turn on one vote. So, I hear people say, oh, I don't know if my vote matters. One vote, people, one vote could make a big difference.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And again, the key, so this is 48 states in the District of Columbia. It's nearly everyone uses this system. And what's so cool is if you go back to the debates of the Constitutional Convention, Pennsylvania's James Wilson, who was an important figure, predicted that this is what was going to happen, would be once a few states permit the American people to vote directly for president, and that would inform who the electors would be, you would see all of this, virtually every state follow suit. And so that the American people's votes, not the state legislature itself, but the American people's votes would help determine who the electors are to the Electoral College.
You keep saying 48. So there's some states that aren't like this, though. Can you dive into, and again, back to how does it actually work? So can you give us a little bit more about the states that don't have a winner take all system?
Yeah, so these days there are only 2. It's Nebraska and Maine. And so they allocate their electoral votes. They have 2 different things. Their first set of electoral votes is determined by the popular vote in each congressional district in the state. And then they assign the last 2 votes that they get from their 2 senators to whoever wins statewide in the state. So it ends up being, it's not completely proportional to what the votes are for the candidates as you see here, but it allows for you to win a couple of congressional districts and at least get a couple of electoral votes, rather than just a sweeping, as you saw of California, 55-0. Here you might have 4 and 1, because candidate Smith, though they lost statewide, won one of the congressional districts in Nebraska.
Got it. Fascinating. So fascinating way that kind of this plays out on the national level and the guidelines from Article 2, but then how it plays out on the state level with the choices that they make, and that only 2 states are doing it like this is also just interesting. Do you know when Nebraska and Maine kind of shifted? Were they like California before and then changed this way, or were they always like this?
I'm not sure, Curry.
Sorry.
I do know that what I do know is like that one of the few Supreme Court cases on the Electoral College is McPherson versus Blacker from 1892, and I know that there Michigan was trying to do this, and it was challenged in the Supreme Court as unconstitutional. The Supreme Court said no, states can do this, and states have been doing it since the founding, so it's okay, and states have broad authority to choose how to elect their electors, and so it was fine. So I don't know if Nebraska and Maine were doing it at a similar time or not, but it's something that was part of a traditional way that certain states decided to choose their electors.
So fascinating. So, okay. So again, I'm writing to say this is kind of complicated. And so
Absolutely.
that's why, so why did the founding fathers pick, and Colin asked in the chat, he goes, how can American consider itself a democracy if the winner of the popular vote doesn't win? So I want to go back in time to 1787 and say, looking at people like Wilson, like Mason, like Madison, why did they come up with this system, and how did they get to the point of the Electoral College?
It's a great question, Kerry. And the one word answer: compromise. Compromise. No one, there wasn't anyone who was like, this is the perfect system. But if we're going back to the Constitutional Convention, you have to remember that when the founders are coming up with what's the presidency going to look like, they were really puzzled. There wasn't a great example in history as to what exactly they were looking for. So they look to Europe, they see powerful kings. They look to the American states, they see weak governors. They don't want either of those. They also don't want what they saw. They just cast off King George III in the American Revolution. So they're aware from the royal officials there of what sort of abuses you can have if you have a powerful executive. And so the founding generation is really trying to figure out something in between a very powerful king and very weak state governors. And so as they're doing this, one thing that they wrestle with as they're thinking about what the president's going to look like is, how are we going to elect this president? What's going to be the connection between the president, Congress, and the American people? And so they're really wrestling with where they want the president's source of political power to lie. They're also, as Kerry has up here, they're thinking of other big issues, like how long should the president be able to serve? 1 year, 2 years, 4? Hamilton wanted the president to serve for life tenure. So there's a great variation in that. Should the president be able to run for re-election? The delegates disagreed on that. And how should the president be? What's going to be the process for impeachment and removal? And so the founders are again debating the big question of what the president's going to look like, how powerful is the president going to be, and then arguing about these details. And as we all know, when we have conversations with our friends or families about big issues like this, constitutional issues especially, there's going to be a few issues that we're focusing on. And as we talk, we may change our minds, and then we may change our minds about the other issues too. And so it's really, really hard to settle on what this set of rules is going to be. And so this is what the delegates of the convention are struggling with. Is really smart people. They know the examples of history and of their own time, and they're struggling with what's the president going to look like, and with that, how are we going to elect the president? And so they end up weighing a lot of different options. Many of the delegates supported the president being elected by Congress. So, no, not by the state legislatures, not by the American people by a popular vote, but by Congress. That was one option. Another option, advanced by Pennsylvania's James Wilson, supported at various times in the convention by Gouverneur Morris and even James Madison. Wilson just said, let's have a national popular vote. It's the simplest system. Let's tally the votes. Whoever has the most votes, they should be president. So Wilson advanced that idea, the idea of a national popular vote. And you saw the delegates really arguing between the congressional election of the president, the popular vote, and if you're looking at the debates over time at the convention, there are many different times during the convention where a strong majority of the delegates supported congressional elections. So we very well could have wound up with that system. But these debates, people end up seeing strengths and weaknesses of those two systems, and eventually the delegates come to a compromise, which is the Electoral College. And I'll let you hop in. It looks like maybe some questions, or we figure out where to take it from there.
I'm sorry, in my head, I'm so physical that poor Tom has to see me nodding like a crazy person. Everybody's trying to and again, and I go back to it's really complicated. But a couple of the questions were around, wait a minute. And I love these questions, wait a minute. So if I go in and vote, I don't vote for president, I actually vote for an elector. And that elector then goes and votes for the president. And that's what we were just clarifying in the Q&A and in the chat was, it's it's this a filter that's on the voting process. And we're going to get into why. Why did they put that filter in there? What was their concerns around it? But yes, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but that's us. And then these are the electorate, and then this is the president. So yes, it's a multi-step process. So just want to clarify that. Tom, do you want to add anything?
No, and it's just like the thing about the electors are, just to get in your head, it really is a group that sits and votes in December in a date set by Congress. They don't really deliberate or argue about the candidates, but they do cast the votes that end up determining who's president. And again, just to get the final piece about the mechanics, which I don't think we mentioned at the outset, is if someone gets a majority of the Electoral College, they become president, even if they don't win the popular vote. So that's one big thing, which a lot of people have already flagged. The other is if no candidate gets a majority in the Electoral College, the presidency is then determined by the House of Representatives, voting by state. And so there's this component of congressional election there if no one can secure an electoral vote majority. These days, the electoral vote majority is 270 or more electoral votes. But that's just one little piece of the mechanics that I wanted to at least get in there.
No, I think it's fascinating and great. And there's all these like different ways this could happen. And I love the questions are flying in now. Everybody's like wants to dig into it, which is awesome. Because when you're having these conversations with your friends, with your family, you need the background story to be able to really engage in the conversation. So let's go back to why. Why did they do this? Like what so there's, we want to have Congress pick the president on one side, to we're going to have the people, Wilson saying like a popular sovereignty, let the people pick the president. So why did they come to a compromise in between, and how did they get there?
Yeah, no, so it's really you have to think about, so both of those approaches, Congress versus the national popular vote, have their own strengths and weaknesses. And the Electoral College ends up at least responding to some of the concerns on each side, which is why it ends up being, at least for the delegates, a sensible compromise. So let's take each of those options, congressional election and the direct popular vote, in turn, and think about the strengths and weaknesses and why the Electoral College. So the congressional vote, what's the benefit of the congressional vote? Why would this be a good idea? Well, from the perspective of the delegates to the convention, they would think that Congress would be the body of some of the most knowledgeable people in the country. That they would be the way the Constitution is set up is to elect the best and the brightest to the Congress. And the delegates are looking at future Congress saying, we're going to be the people sitting in the future Congresses. It would be a good idea if we got to select the president because we are really knowledgeable. We're going to know who these candidates are. We're not just going to know what policies they support, which are important, but also we're going to know a bit about their character. Because for the founding generation, this idea of virtue and serving the public good was a real key component of what they wanted from their leaders, both in Congress and for president. And so that's the advantage of the congressional vote. What's the downside? Gouverneur Morris, another delegate, one of the, I think, really one of the most colorful and interesting delegates at the convention, says, well, what's the problem with this? Well, if you have a bunch of people in a distant national capital behind closed doors selecting a president, isn't that going to lead to corruption? Aren't people going to be looking at their self-interest or factional interest rather than the interests of all of the people? And I love the way Gouverneur Morris puts it, it will be the work of intrigue, of cabal, of faction. And so like the idea here being, if it's Congress, it's going to be a bunch of powerful people in Washington, far away from the people selecting the president. They might look out for their own interests. They might abuse their power. And the president will not be independent of Congress. The president, who we want to be independent, to be able to check Congress, is going to rely on Congress for his or her own political power. And so, again, the founding generation was really concerned that Congress was going to be the most powerful branch. And so that becomes a problem. Now, why? So that's a bit about the congressional vote.
And basically you're saying it could be worse.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And then just to take a quick beat on the national popular vote, which, is how we select a lot of our government officials today. The argument in support by James Wilson is a pretty simple one. It's that, our nation is rooted in popular sovereignty, ruled by we the people. And the simplest way to get that in a presidential election is to have everyone vote and count them up nationally, and whoever has the most votes nationally wins. And so, that's Wilson's argument. Now, why did few of the delegates, support this? Now, Gouverneur Morris did, James Madison eventually did, but this idea lost. Now, what were some of the problems with the national popular vote? Now, one is just raw elitism. There were elitists like Elbridge Gerry at the convention that just thought excessive democracy is a problem and we need to check that. But, one thing that's easy to underestimate and to forget today is that for so many of the delegates, the problem was, can this work practically? We're creating the largest republic in the history of the world. People live spread out through this huge, this huge country. It's hard to travel from place to place. There aren't newspapers outside of the cities in a lot of places. And so, people know their local leaders. They may even know their state leaders, but they may not know national leaders from other states. And so ends up being a problem of information. Will the American people, if they're called on to choose between different national candidates, know anything about these candidates? So like the first election, everyone knows George Washington. Everyone loves George Washington. Of course they're going to vote for him. But after Washington, how many other Washingtons are there going to be? Are people going to know who any of these candidates are? And the founding generation was really concerned about that. So you have there the congressional vote, national popular vote. Towards the end of the convention, both sides converge around the Electoral College. And so what does the Electoral College accomplish here? Well, one, it solves Gouverneur Morris's dilemma. So the Electoral College is this separate body. It's separate from Congress that elects the president. And so the president's source of political power is separate from Congress. It creates an independent base of political power for the president that dissolves right after the election. And so in a way, it's a separation of powers provision too, where it's keeping the president independent of Congress, doesn't need Congress to vote for him to be in office. And so it sort of sets up that particular mechanism. The other is that take Alexander Hamilton, who, because of the great musical is the founder of the moment or of the decade or whatever you would want to say. Hamilton looks at the Electoral College and says, a lot of those critiques of national popular vote are right. People are not going to know very much about who the candidates are. The Electoral College ends up being, an important body that's created that hopefully we have very knowledgeable people in there. They're going to know all these national candidates, much like the members of Congress would, and that they, when necessary, could exercise independent judgment to select the candidates for president. Now, the one thing to place on the table, and we've already sort of emphasized this, is what you see, on the one hand, you have Hamilton, arguing for the importance of independent judgment for the electors. But we see already that that's in tension at the convention with this idea that the Electoral College is going to allow the states to determine how electors are being selected. And so you have sort of Hamilton's independent judgment on the one hand, and then you have this idea of the Electoral College as a key federalism measure on the other. And you see already that they're in tension right here from the very beginning.
And I think that's a great lead in to my favorite part of this story. And a great question in the Q&A is, hey, what happens if two presidents tie in electoral votes? Who would win the presidency? Okay, that's a two-part answer. One is, what happens in 1800 if that happens under the original system before the 12th Amendment? And then what would happen today? And I'm pretty sure we can't exactly tie, but it is a really good question. So thank you for that question, because you perfectly tee us up to one of my favorite conversations, the election of 1800s. And I feel like we should be playing the musical right now and the song from Hamilton, but the tie. So when we look at the electoral votes being equal between Jefferson and Burr, and Adams is no longer there, lay out the story for us, Tom. And everybody get ready and listen with your popcorn, because you're going to hold on to this one. It's a really cool one. It's a really tense part of American history. Go, Tom.
Yeah, and as Craig just pointed out, we can actually still tie today, 269, 269.
Great,
so this is even, this story solves some problems, but not all problems. So the election of 1800, what you could talk about this forever, but it's this amazing. Initially, it's an election between it's a rematch between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. So you have two of the most famous founders of the nation going toe to toe for president. Adams won the first time, Jefferson wins the second time. What you also see working here is that the founders didn't foresee the emergence of political parties. And so the entire Constitution is not designed necessarily to cope with some of the distinct problems of political parties, but by the election of 1800, we already see the emergence of two separate parties, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. And we see John Adams largely, he's associated with the Federalists, Jefferson with the Democratic Republicans, and Jefferson here running in the election of 1800 effectively with Aaron Burr, his fellow Democratic Republican. And so what happens in this election? Well, first, Adams loses. Jefferson gets 73 electoral votes, so does Aaron Burr. Adams only gets 65, so he loses. And so we have a split of the electoral vote, 73 to 73, Jefferson and Burr, the running mates. Now, the thing to remember is that under the original Constitution, the electors in the Electoral College are casting 2 votes for president. So it's different than the system today. They're casting 2 votes for president. The person who receives the most votes becomes the president. The person who receives, the next most votes becomes the vice president. But here we see these 2 founders running together, Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, tying. This system allows people to tie 73 to 73. And so what happens then? This was the question that you used, Kerry, to frame us at the beginning. What happens then? Well, Aaron Burr decides, I'm not going to stand aside. Everyone knows as they're observing this election, Thomas Jefferson is supposed to be the president. Aaron Burr is supposed to be the vice president. But the mechanics under the Constitution say, in the event of a tie, this election goes to the U.S. House of Representatives. And so the U.S.
Oh, sorry to interrupt, but
please.
that was Julie's great question. She's like, but I thought they were running together. And they were. And it was supposed to be Jefferson and then Burr. And then Burr basically doesn't back down. He says, no, well, let it work out the way we want it to. So I always think it's a funny, Hamilton, the musical, taught us to question Burr. And this one actually gives us a little more information around him too. But keep going, Tom. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no, not at all. That's a great point. And so, yeah, Burr, people might have expected Burr to stand aside. He said, no, I'm just going to let the constitutional system play out. And so the U.S. House of Representatives has to determine who's going to win this election. Now, who's in the U.S. House? It's the Federalists. It's the opposition party that just lost the election. It's the old Congress that decides who's going to become president. And so they have, they have rounds and rounds of votes. How many? They have 36 ballots over 6 days trying to determine who should be president of the United States. And in the end, it's Federalists like Alexander Hamilton, just like the song, The Election of 1800 in the musical Hamilton. That part of the song's quite true. Hamilton comes out and says, look, I disagree with Jefferson about, in the musical, everything. But Jefferson has beliefs, Burr has none, is how it goes in the musical. And that's the idea. Hamilton saying, I disagree with Jefferson, but he's a person of virtue. He thinks differently than I do, but he has core beliefs. Burr, we can't trust. How do we know we can't trust him? Look at what he's doing right here. It's not the sort of character you want in your president. And so that's what Hamilton's saying. Federalists then, some Federalists in the US House then permit the votes for Thomas Jefferson. He becomes president. And again, we have to remember, looming in the background, this is a very early election. You have state militias getting ready to be called out by Jeffersonian governors in Pennsylvania and Virginia. There's menace, there's violence, there's a possibility of that. But in the end, the founding generation is able to forge a compromise. Jefferson becomes president. And, importantly, it sets this precedent. It's the first time in American history we have a sitting president lose to someone from the opposition party. And that president, John Adams, stands aside, leaves, and Jefferson becomes president. And so it's really this amazing, it's this amazing episode. And as you might imagine, Kerry and everyone, we, the American people, look at this episode and say, we got to do something about this. This was crazy. We can't have these ties. We now have these political parties. We got to figure out what to do. And what's so cool about the Constitution is that the founding generation knew that we would learn things over time. They put a process, the Article 5 amendment process, in the Constitution that would let us amend it. And here we are, less than 2 decades after the Philadelphia Convention, facing a crisis and saying, let's learn from this experience and amend the Constitution. That's how we get the 12th Amendment.
And I think that's really important to kind of bring out, not just because the kind of the storyline is so amazing in that, but also that it came to this point, to this head, and it was almost chaos, and it was almost a civil war. And then that moves people forward to amend the Constitution, which is not an easy thing to do, but they know this system is not working. So very quickly, they go from the Electoral College, how it's spelled out, to, okay, it's not working anymore. How does the 12th Amendment change the way the system works? And then I'm going to poll the audience with a modern question. And the 12th Amendment is kind of like the hint and the answer to how it was answered. So 12th Amendment, Tom, break it down for us.
Mercifully, we won't read that block of text. Basically,
wait, I have 2 blocks if you didn't have enough.
Oh, okay, so even more. No, so the 12th Amendment, what it says is we don't want these ties anymore. We know that political parties are emerging. And so what we want the electors will still get 2 votes in the Electoral College. They'll cast 1 for president and 1 for vice president. And so presumably in the election of 1800, that would mean they would have casted their vote very clearly for Jefferson as president, Burr for vice president. maybe each got 73 electoral votes, but it'd be very clear who the president should be and who the vice president should be. And that's the fundamental change. And the other one though is that no longer are we going to have the person who finishes in second place become the vice president. So John Adams had Thomas Jefferson as his vice president after the election of 1796. Imagine after the election of 2016, we have President Donald Trump and we have Vice President Hillary Clinton. You can imagine how weird an arrangement and how difficult it can be to have someone as your vice president who's your political rival. And so we also, through setting up this mechanism, make it clear, we acknowledge party's going to put forward tickets. And so the electors will vote for someone for president, someone for vice president, presumably a ticket that's been endorsed by one of the political parties.
Okay, so I'm going to actually, we have about 5 minutes left. So what I'd love to be able to do is kind of fast forward to modern conversation. And I know some of the conversation was about the faithless electors, but the other conversation a lot of our people are asking, and we also talked about it earlier, about the National Interstate Compact. So looking at kind of how the states vote, and getting back to the original question is, what are the pros and cons of the Electoral College system today? When we think about these conversations and we want people to walk into the dinner table to, a Zoom call with their friends and able to really understand it, can you lay out for us, Tom, the arguments on both sides and the valid arguments on both sides of either A, why you want to keep the Electoral College, or B, why you would want to change the Electoral College? Because I think that's really what's spinning around many people's conversations, and we want to give them all the tools they need to have that dialogue and listen to others as well.
Well, that's great. And I mean, so we have a little bit of time. First, what are the pros? Like, so if you're in support of the Electoral College, you think we should still have it. What are the key arguments in favor? I'd say the key argument is still something that you saw at the convention itself, which is people really support the fact that it maintains a system of federalism. It maintains a key role for the states in shaping how presidential elections will happen. And importantly, from even a modern perspective for the proponents of the Electoral College, the argument is the Electoral College, if you didn't have an Electoral College and just had a popular vote, you would just see presidential candidates going to big states. They would ignore small states. So they would go to big states where they can mine the most votes. That's where candidates would campaign. That's where the campaigns would focus. And it would leave out all of the small states and their interests as part of the campaign process. That's, I'd say the gist of that's the pro. If you're looking at the con, what's the con? Well, I'd say it's two parts. One is think back to James Wilson at the convention. It's still the same argument that proponents are making today, which is that, there's something, they would argue that there's something unfair about the person who has fewer popular votes across the country becoming president. So for again, rooting it in what Wilson had to say, the Electoral College is, from his perspective, was a decent compromise, but even better would be a popular vote system that really links the presidency in popular sovereignty ruled by we the people. The other is, that the people who say that we should replace the Electoral College is that, the Electoral College also makes it so that presidential campaigns focus on a handful of states that could go to one party or the other. And so this is, the purple states, the swing states, whatever you want to call them, but the presidential candidates and the money from their campaigns flood into these few states that can really, go one way or the other, and the rest of the country ends up getting ignored by the presidential candidate. So it's a flip of what the proponents say, but both of them are arguing that, we would want a system that allows for a genuine national election where a diverse set of states and a diverse set of people are being heard, and that you need to campaign to those folks.
And I think that's a really good way to break it down. I also just put a link to the podcast that we had last week on this, where we get the two top experts kind of laying it down. So if you want to dig in even deeper, you can absolutely do that. And Tom, as we think about this, the National Interstate Compact is a little different. That relies a little stronger on the use of the states to kind of maneuver. It wouldn't take a constitutional amendment change. It would, is that your dog? I love your dog.
Someone just knocked on our door, so my apologies to everyone.
No, it's fun. But it gives some power back to the states in the system of federalism to say how they determine the use of their votes is a way that can happen. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely, Kerry. So yeah, no, this is part of the debate over whether or not to amend, or whether or not to abolish the Electoral College and replace it with something else also goes back to this question of constitutional reform, more broadly. And the thing to remember is that the founding generation put Article 5 in. We can amend the Constitution, so we can learn from experience, but that any amendment is going to have to attract great supermajoritarian support that crosses. I'm sorry for my dog in the background here. There's nothing I can do about it.
It's all right. Just keep going.
Yeah, no, so it ends up.
So I think
1 second.
he wants to just add into the conversation. So the way that they're looking at that, and I can send you guys a link around that, is they're saying that the state, if they sign into this compact, would be respectful of the national vote. So if the national popular vote went to one candidate, the state would then say, we're going to give our votes, our electoral votes, to that candidate. So I believe, Tom, and I could be wrong on this, I think there's around 12 states that have joined that compact so far, but there was some like questioning around it and kind of the movement around it. And there's been conversations around this for years, since the 1970s, about what changes we could do to the Electoral College and what ways we want to keep it together and keep it the way it is and level it between the states.
Yeah, so I think it's a total of 15 states and the District of Columbia have signed on. So it's states in the District of Columbia representing 198 electoral votes. And again, I think that the thing to keep in mind is it's a way of, again, harnessing the state's power under the Electoral College. It's the power of federalism to think about different ways of reforming the system. And this is a creative alternative, because I think it's different states coming together, using their power as states to figure out a way to work around the supermajoritarian requirements, the fact that we need very broad support to pass a constitutional amendment. And so this is a way of harnessing the system as it exists in Article 2 to do that.
Yeah, and I think it's fascinating on both sides, the way that the top scholars are presenting this as, here's why it's so supportive and here's why it's not. I have to be honest with you, I keep diving into the dialogue and the conversation, and I haven't made up my mind at all, which makes it even more fascinating to listen to. And on that note, I want to let everybody know that on Friday at 1 o'clock, we're having Professor Tara Ross join us. And she's going to kind of break it down with Jeff and add into the conversation. So if you guys want to continue this discussion, continue this conversation, we can see you at Friday, 1 o'clock Eastern time. But Tom, I want to thank you so much. I think it's Henry, right? Your dog's Henry.
It is Henry. Yes, Henry wanted to participate, so my apologies, everyone.
No, I think Henry wanted to get into the debate. Henry's like, I got some words for this. But I think it's really fun. And thank you so much, Tom. This was a great class. And as Jim said, much appreciated breaking down the understanding. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
I'm going to stop the recording.